Hello, everyone, and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, as always, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I want to thank you for joining me today for episode number 327. In just a moment, I'll be sharing with you an interview I did with Carl Pepper Cappuccio, who is a hospice nurse who primarily works on call after hours nursing. And we'll talk a little bit about what's really unique about that type of work in hospice, and also about Carl's book, Warm Water, The Last Act of Compassion, which is a book of stories about patients and families he's worked with. So that's coming up in just a moment. Before we get to it, I want to remind you that I have a second podcast called What Really Matters, Everyday Spirituality. And there will be a link to that podcast in the show notes for this episode if you're interested in checking it out. It's all solo episodes where I'm talking about some of the spiritual lessons that I'm working on right now and things that I'm reading and learning. So you'll find it in the link in the show notes, but it's also available on all the major platforms where you listen to podcasts, What Really Matters. And today also, I want to thank my newest supporter on Patreon, Cindy Spence. Thank you so much for joining the team and helping us move a little closer to our goal of 25 new supporters, at which point I will be able to start adding transcriptions for every podcast episode, which some people have requested. So to get to the goal, we need 22 more supporters. But I want to thank all of you who've been supporting the podcast over months and years now. I really appreciate your contributions, and not only the financial support, but also the emotional and spiritual inspiration it gives to me to know that you're out there and that you want to hear more content like this on this podcast. So thanks again. And if you're interested in joining, you can go to Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. So now we'll move on with my interview with Pepper Cappuccio. I wanted to mention his birth name is Carl, but his nickname is Pepper, and he says he primarily goes by the name of Pepper, but you'll hear me switching back and forth between Carl and Pepper during the interview. I had to apologize to him for that, but I got a little bit mixed up as we were talking because I have both names written down on my paper of notes here. So anyway, Carl and Pepper are the same person, but he prefers to go by Pepper, just so you know as you listen. So after this interview, remember, I'll come back at the end with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go. Today, I'm very happy to welcome my guest, Carl Pepper Cappuccio. Carl became a registered nurse more than 15 years ago and has served as a hospice nurse for over 10 years. In that period of time, he has had the honor and privilege to assist hundreds of patients through the dying process, as well as perform the tasks associated with those patients at or just after the time of death. Carl is the author of the book, Warm Water, The Last Act of Compassion, which we'll be discussing today. And you can learn more about Carl and his book at the website peppercappuccio.com, and Cappuccio is spelled CAPPUCCIO.com. So Pepper, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Karen, for having me on the show.
Yeah, I've been really interested in talking with you, for one thing, about the book, but also just about the work that you've been doing as a hospice nurse. And because I always love hearing the stories of hospice nurses, because even though most of us have similar training in hospice and we're all working with patients who are at the end of life, it seems like each one of us has a unique perspective and really interesting stories to share. So I'm excited to hear more from you and learn more about your book. But maybe you could just start by telling us your own story and what inspired you to become a nurse and then to become a hospice nurse in particular.
That's a good question. The beginning of my adult life, I worked in the region here in the Atlantic City casinos. And at the same time, I had three sisters, all of whom are labor and delivery nurses, and they work with one's a midwife, one's a practitioner, nurse practitioner. They were all in the nursing field, along with upwards of almost 20 people in my family are nurses. They had tried to convince me back then to be a nurse, but I just did not want to do it. I did, though, however, decide around 40 years old to go back to college and become a nurse. Subsequently, I started working on the med-surg floor. Was not very happy about it. It seemed kind of rushed, kind of just mundane, doing the same thing every day and being so busy and short-staffed most of the time, not having the opportunity to give that extra bedside care, like emotional support, to a patient or families when they were there. So I just, continued on, did the best I can until 2008, when we had an unfortunate event happen. My mother was diagnosed with lung cancer, stage 4. So she began the usual course of treatment, chemotherapy and radiation, which became futile. It was too far advanced, and it was painfully obvious to us that she was not going to survive this diagnosis, this illness. So after careful discussion with my siblings and my mother, we came to the decision to place her on hospice. And immediately I saw the tender love and care and attention afforded patients and families by the nurse in hospice. And it was something that I knew right away, that once I get through this period with my mother's illness and her eventual passing away, that's the kind of nursing that I wanted to do.
I love that story, and I've heard something similar many times, both from nurses and doctors like myself, that it was an encounter with hospice that sort of awakened us all to the idea that we could really practice the kind of medicine that we long to in our hearts, this connection with patients and really being there fully and meeting all of their needs as a person, that hospice is the place where that is possible, even though in much of the rest of medicine, it almost seems to prohibit or prevent that kind of care to be given. So I love it that that's part of your story.
Thank you.
So one thing that is unique, and as I've talked with you before about your service in hospice, is that you have done, I think, the majority of your hospice work as an on-call nurse, meaning that you work a lot of night shifts and you do a lot of crisis calls. And so I'm curious about that. What made you decide to fulfill that role in your hospice? And just talk to us a little more about that.
Through my training at Samaritan Hospice in New Jersey, where I continue to work, you have to have a pretty rigorous orientation. So you do the daytime nursing, where you have a census. You can hang out with a social worker, and you go around the whole circle of people who are in that team that takes care of the patient. And the position that really felt like a perfect fit for me was the visiting on call. One, because it affords you much more flexibility. Again, you're not rushed. You have to take all the time you need. And two, as I've always been a night person, so it seemed like a perfect fit. At the time, they were having trouble at the organization because there's some areas, especially in the wintertime and in the inner cities, some poor, underprivileged areas where the female nurses were not comfortable going out alone in the middle of the night to care for a patient in their home. So they sort of steered me in that direction, being a male nurse, to do that. And it worked out perfectly fine.
And it seems like such a unique position to be in, making crisis calls, emergency calls really, to families after hours. And as you said, because for one thing, you're not carrying a census load, so you don't have a whole list of patients that you have to see. You get a call and you have to see that person and their family, and maybe you have a second call also. But it does seem like that there is this nice little space in time when you come in the midst of crisis of one type or another, but you have the time to actually spend with them, to actually figure out how to fix it. And even though these are families and patients that you haven't met before, it seemed to me, at least from reading your book, that you actually end up connecting with them fairly deeply during your visits with them, even though it's in the midst of a crisis, or maybe because it's a crisis, you end up really connecting with them.
That's correct. I do. I've always been someone who's been so acutely aware of my surroundings. So when I, go out into the car, and I just explain this in each of the chapters of the book, I describe exactly what I'm doing, sort of what I'm feeling, the music that might be in the car. And then when I get to the home, I immediately notice the surroundings, the type of home, the room that the patient may be staying in, books that they may have read, music they might be listening to. And it's very interesting to me that many times these things are very similar to my own life. So it's one of the things that I've learned from, I guess, these patients is that while we're all different people, we're all kind of the same. We're all interconnected. And if you're open to it and you're aware of it, you can just look around and take notice. Everything is there that's similar.
And that comes through beautifully in the book. As you said, you describe so well even the temperature outside, the weather conditions when you're driving to a home in the neighborhood you're driving through, then what the home is like, and describing the people that you're interacting with. So I can tell that you are very sensitive in terms of picking up on all of those details, which it makes the stories that you tell very rich. But I assume that makes your experience is really rich for you too as well, because you're not just going through the motions, you're taking all of it in and really appreciating everything that's happening in that moment.
Yes, that's true. It's almost like I'm trying to put myself in the mind or the shoes of the patient that you're taking care of. So you want to try to relate to them in a way. So sometimes I'll have a discussion with them about certain artwork on the wall, or pictures and things like that, photos of their family members. You try to tie everything in, because the whole goal for us as a hospice nurse is to go with these patients and families. We're navigating them down this journey that they already know they're going on, and they of course are very aware of what the final outcome is going to be. So our job is to get them through that as peacefully and comfortably as possible, with as much dignity and respect as possible.
And Carl, I know from the stories you tell, oftentimes you are called in after the patient has already died. So you're called to come in to pronounce the death. But you end up being there at this very unique and special time with the families, and being present with the body after the death. And it seems to me that that's a really rich time. And a lot of people in hospice don't necessarily get to be there for those moments. The people visiting during the daytime, who are just making visits on a scheduled basis, may not be present when the death happens or shortly after the death. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about what that's like for you a little bit, is being there so often right at the time of death or shortly thereafter with your patients.
That's another good question. I often explain that, particularly in the book, that most of the time I get there, the patient already passed away. But there's a couple of times a handful of times in my career where I've had that opportunity, and I call it a privilege, I guess, to be there as that patient is passing away. And it can be a very surreal experience. And again, it takes you back to when it may have happened to you as well. But getting back to that whole moment that you're there, I explain in the book and to other people that I talk to all the time that when I get there and the patient has passed away, the family already knows. They have a good sense that they're gone, but they still need that declaration, that affirmation from you to tell them that the patient has passed away. So the first thing I do when I get to the home is I usually greet it at the door, and I am very careful to not say, "Where's the patient?" I often say, "Where's Mr. Jones?" or "Where is Robert?" And then they take me back, and I go through sort of a routine, almost like theater, where I take the stethoscope out and I listen for the heartbeat, listen for the lungs, take the blood pressure, and then I have to turn around and the family member is there, or there's a group of them, and they're kind of huddled together with this desperate anticipation of waiting to hear you say that, "I'm so sorry, they've passed away. They're no longer with us." So with that immediate realization that this has happened, everything else starts to kind of go into motion. So the first thing I do after we have determined that the patient has passed away is I ask the family to give me a little space and privacy so I can do my post-mortem care. And hence the title of the book, Warm Water, The Last Act of Compassion, is defining that even though someone has passed away, they obviously can't feel anything physically. You don't use cool water or room temperature water. I actually draw warm water in a basin and give them that last bath before I can prepare them to go to either the funeral home or wherever the family is going to send their loved one. So it really is the last dignified act of compassion that we can do for our patients. And quite frankly, it really makes the family feel good about it as well, because they've just lost their loved one, right? They're possibly devastated by that. They're going to begin the grief process and mourn. So they're actually very pleased, I find, that we take the time, that I do that's in my nursing practice, to be sure that it's warm water for that patient.
And from the stories in your book, it does seem that some families really want to be part of that process and help you with the bathing process of their loved one. Others seem maybe relieved that you will do that for them.
Yes, that's true. It's on a case by case basis. I would prefer in my practice and my experience that I can do it alone, because certain things can happen. You don't want them to be witness to all those things. If it's a daughter with their father in the bed, you want privacy. She probably doesn't want to see him being clothes taken off and washed like that. But again, I do give that opportunity. The most frequent time when a family member wants to stay during that warm bath is usually a parent or a wife.
Yes, that makes sense to me. It's that seems very fitting, that a parent might want to be part of, who has bathed their child throughout their childhood years, might want to be part of that very last act. And so I'm curious, you do describe in the book really well the music that you listen to. You mentioned that already in the car, and it seems like that's important for you. Music plays an important role for you in your life in general, but also in your work. And would you talk a little bit about that, about how music helps you?
Music, of course, transcends a lot of things. And it's one of those senses, when you hear a song from years ago, it can take you right back to what was happening at that time. And oftentimes the music can connect to the situation that you're in as well. It's almost like this is a sign from beyond. I'll hear a song that's just so related to different things. There's a chapter in the book where this daughter is taking such beautiful, loving care of her mother. And I stayed there and watched her do this final bath for her mother while she was still alive. And I remember leaving. And then when I came back, there was all this beautiful music being played by Mario Lanza. So it tugged at my heartstrings because it was my mother's favorite person to listen to. She loved Mario Lanza, loved that voice of his and all that music. So I was just so struck when I heard the song, and then as I got closer upstairs to, start taking care of that patient, getting her ready to go to the funeral home, the song came on, and the song was "I Walked with God" from the student Prince with Mario Lanza. And I got very emotional because that's the song my mother wanted played, and it was played at her funeral in the church. It was a beautiful sentiment. So that's one aspect of the music in my life. The other is that it really puts me in a better mood, helps me to unwind, maybe decompress a little bit. So I like to have the music on as sort of a relaxation technique or a therapy for myself before and sometimes on the way home as well. Sometimes it doesn't seem to have, I don't have the desire to put it on if it's an unusually stressful case, but most times I do put it on.
Do you have favorite music that you like to listen to? I know sometimes you've noted in the book that you turn the radio on and you have radio stations you like to listen to, but...
Yes, it's usually that soft rock kind of thing from the 1980s. Barry Manilow, Dionne Warwick, one of my favorites, Barbra Streisand. Frank Sinatra is another favorite of mine. That's the kind of music that I put on during the hours that I work. Usually, I like all music. I listen to opera, Broadway tunes, sometimes rock. It depends on the mood or the setting. But typically, when I do that, when I'm working, going to a pronouncement or where I think someone might be dying, I put on something that's a little bit calmer. So I try to calm my nerves down to make sure that I don't go in there all hyper and overly excited or anything like that, because it is a very somber time for most patients and their families.
That's something that I've always recommended to nurses who are working in the field, who make a lot of visits from home to home, and they have to shift their mindset pretty quickly from one patient to the next while they're driving. And I've always suggested, listen to some music because it can help you, set aside the previous visit, because you need to get yourself present and all there for the next patient. So you can't take the previous patient into the next home with you. You have to be able to leave that. And it seems to me music is a great way to do that.
It is. And it's, the nurses that work during the day, of course, they build that rapport with these patients. So their decompression is much more, I think, important than someone who works in my department, because as you said earlier, almost 100% of the time when I go see a patient, whether it's for symptom management or for fully catheter change or their death, it's the first time I've ever met that patient. So you don't have that sense of loss that you might have if you see them 4, 5, 6, 7 times. There are instances in some of the chapters in the book where, that I did develop a relationship with the patient, and those were extremely difficult to handle when they did pass away.
Yes, I remember one story that I really loved, a young man named Lewis, whose mother was an artist, I guess, and at the end of after Lewis died, that you described walking away and feeling that something wasn't complete and that there was something more. And I don't know if you want to go on and tell that story of how it ended up.
That's so interesting that you bring that up. That is in this in this set of stories in this book that is probably the most favorite of my stories, because it goes to that interconnectedness that happens, especially in the story. So Lewis was on a morphine infusion. So my job when I got called out was usually for the pain management. And I'd go to the home and I would go in and I would meet the parents and sometimes the brother, and to take care of increasing the rate on the pump for the pain medicine. So as I described in the chapter, each time I went in, the mother was bedside right next to her son, waiting for me to get there. And I would come in and she, after a few visits, recognized who I was, but she always would just stand up, it seemed, hurriedly and say, "Thank you for coming." And she would leave the room. And I sensed that this was a difficult case from the very beginning because of the anticipated grief, the situation of a mother about to lose their son. So I kind of red flagged it in the organization computer that we're going to need more emotional support and bereavement counseling, possibly when the inevitable occurs. So as goes on in the chapter, I went there several times until one time it was the call that we dreaded, of course, that Lewis had passed away. So I drive in to the home and I go inside, and the brother's there, the father's there, and the mother's there. And I could not imagine her pain, the loss that she just experienced. And I was about to start talking to her about that. And she just again stood up and kissed her son on the forehead, touched his hand, and she said, "Thank you so much for coming." It was a little bit more reactionary, but not really a lot. And she left the room again. And I thought, this is really kind of sad. And I felt so bad. And the husband said, we'll handle it. We're okay. So I continued on, did my postmortem care, got Lewis ready to go to the funeral home. On the way home, I thought, I guess that's it. Nothing I can do. But I kind of, in a almost selfish way, thought she didn't have closure, but neither did I, because the whole picture, the whole complete package of hospice is you take somebody down through that journey, right? And then when you get to the end, your first priority really is to turn your attention from the patient solely and to go towards the family or the loved ones to help them start that grieving process. And I was unable to do that. So I talked to my manager, talked to one of the bereavement counselors, and they said they would reach out to the mother and see if they could help her. But I had to just let it go. So I did. The story continues a few months down the road. I had just moved into my new home, and my best friend Ann calls me and says, "I want to come over and I have a couple of gifts for you, housewarming gifts." I said, "Okay." About a half hour later, the doorbell rings. Here comes Ann. And I could see immediately these beautifully wrapped presents were very thin. I could tell they were either, some kind of photo or a mirror or some kind of picture to put on the wall. So I, of course, invited her in and I immediately opened them up. And they are a pair of beautifully drawn, painted lilies. Thought they were tulips at first, but they're lilies. They're very, very pretty. And I said, "We're going to hang these right away." So I hang the first picture, I hang the second one, and I noticed, there's a signature on the bottom of the artist who did this beautiful work. To my surprise and astonishment, delight, really, the artist who drew these pictures was that mother of Lewis, who I had that unsatisfying closure a few months before. So unbeknownst to my friend Ann, because I never discussed patients for the confidentiality reasons in healthcare, she stopped at some flea market or some kind of a yard sale and saw these prints and brought them to me. And it was just sort of like a divine intervention type thing. So I stayed with my friend for a little while. She went home, and then I went through the records and I called the house again and talked to. I really asked for her, and she was not answering the phone. Her husband said she's still taking it hard. He said, but now you know where my wife went every time we were here. And any other person from hospice, she would excuse herself because of this terrible grief that she was having, terrible time that she had with losing her son. She would go in the other side of the house into her studio, and she would paint, draw. So isn't that such a beautiful story?
Wow. Yes, it's just the synchronicity of it is just so touching. And it just reminds me of so often, or probably really all the time, we're in the right place at the right time. We just may not know it, And as you said, we're all connected in ways that we don't even recognize. And you got this blessing of receiving those paintings and to be able to actually see with your own eyes the connection that was there. And I love that story. I agree with you. That was one of my favorite stories of the book too.
Thank you.
Well, one thing that impresses me in the book, I wanted to ask you how you chose the stories for this book, because you've done a great job. When you look at the whole of the book and the stories you've chosen to tell, they really do a good job of depicting the cross-section of patients that might be cared for in a hospice, patients of all different ages, of different socioeconomic status, different religions and cultures and ethnicity. And you've done such a good job of portraying that. And so I think it's a good image for maybe someone who's not so familiar with hospice to read these stories and recognize that hospice is good for everyone and hospice can take care of everyone. No one is excluded or left out of hospice care. Everyone who wants it is welcome there, and the hospice staff is trained to be able to take care of everyone. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how and why you chose the stories you did.
Thank you. That's yet another great question. When I started writing the book, I had a lot of time on my hands. I had become ill myself, and I'm thankfully well now. And I started writing, and then it kind of kept morphing into different things. And I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to put the focus on the book and how I wanted to impact the reader. And the final answer came to me when I remember that myself being a very talkative, conversationalist person. I'm a people person. I'm always talking. I would just quite naturally, after I would do the postmortem care, I would talk to the loved ones to try to ease their burden or try to maybe distract them from that emotional moment. And they would just open up immediately, everyone. Almost every family does this. And they start telling stories. They start reliving their life's experience about their loved ones. And that is very well recognized in the field as being one of the most effective, if not the most effective way to start a healthy grieving process for most people. So that, together with seeing and being absolutely fascinated by all the different religious traditions and cultures, the diversity among the patients that we see, I thought, wouldn't that be a great idea to pick and choose? There's 22 separate stories in the book, and use those to illustrate all the different cultures and traditions that people have. Because I know in my own family, being Italian, there's certain things that happen like automatically after someone dies. The neighbors kick in and the family starts coming in, and all these traditional foods, et cetera, and so on. So I deliberately picked as many different cultures, ethnic backgrounds, religions, et cetera, that I could to make this book as appealing as it could to as many people as I can. And the feedback that I get from most people after they read the book is they were so happy to realize that they had the same feelings and thoughts. People that maybe weren't dealing with a patient on hospice, they just lost someone. And they kind of, I've had some people tell me they wish they had that part of the experience where someone could guide them through the end of life journey that they had to experience. And that's one of the many things that hospice affords people. It's a shame, as you probably know, the average stay on hospice is a very short time, and people can come on much earlier and enjoy the benefits of that type of care in their own surroundings.
That's so true. And this might be one of the things you and I talked about in our prior conversation was about the fact, the uniqueness of hospice, and that home care does not fulfill the same function that hospice does. And maybe we should reiterate that now for listeners, that hospice care and home care are not the same, and home care is not really a substitute for hospice, even though I hear people sometimes saying that, oh, it doesn't matter if you have a hospice, you're on home care, you'll be fine.
That's true. There are some organizations that will link up with a patient in the hospital who might be, say, having a rough time with their cancer treatment, and they decide they're going to stop the cancer treatment, and the hospital will discharge the patient home on home care. Not hospice, home care. And home care is going in that direction of sort of curative and sort of palliative, and trying to right the ship, as it were, to get that patient feeling better, to give them more added, maybe physical therapy or occupational therapy in the home, or maybe IV antibiotics because they have an infection. Whereas hospice is much more specific. It's actually a form of or a type of home care. So those patients going home are not going to try to cure or abate that disease that they're having the most difficulty with. And in addition to that, when you're on hospice, and most people don't know this, that's the only, I guess, caveat or stipulation with hospice is that when you sign on for, say, cancer or, say, kidney failure, you have to maybe stop your treatment. You do have to stop your curative treatment, the aggressive treatment to cure, or maybe you have to stop your treatment, such as dialysis for the kidney. But we're allowed to treat the whole person. So we still take care of your diabetes. We still take care of your high blood pressure and wounds and things like that. Just because you're in hospice doesn't mean you stop taking care of the whole person. You're just saying that we recognize that we're not going to be able to cure that disease for what they're coming off for. So to me, it's really a no-brainer. I think everybody should go the hospice route if there's a situation where it's something that they can't, get rid of.
And I wanted to emphasize too that hospice also cares for the family. And in many ways, you play a huge role in helping families, because sometimes you arrive when the patient has already died. So there's, you do the postmortem care for that patient. But a lot of your role is how you interact with the family, as you were just describing, being willing to listen, ask them questions and listen, and helping them start the grieving process. And that is something that I don't see that happening in any other area of healthcare, where the family receives that kind of loving support and attention, and the time that you're able to give to the family during that really those precious moments right after their loved one has died.
That's very true. The patients, particularly at the end of the journey, may be sleeping all day or in a coma. So you attend to them, of course, first. But once they're settled and comfortable, hopefully pain-free and breathing more easy, I personally, I turn to the family and I might ask them, can I do for you? Because they're equally as important as the patient for obvious reasons. Of course, they're mourning, they have anticipated grief that's occurring, but also they're the caregiver. They're doing all the work when you're not there, right? They're instructed, they're taught how to administer meds, how to maybe change the patient if they're soiled, or how to administer the medications and all. So the focus really is on them as well. And I think if we do our job well enough, that comes through, and they're very appreciative about that, the family.
And I wanted, there are more things some more stories I want to talk about in the book, but I wanted to take a little aside right here to discuss the fact that you are a male nurse, so you're working in a profession that is predominantly female. And for me, when I started in medicine, I was far outnumbered by male medical students and practitioners in my field. So I understand what it's like to be in the minority in that profession. And I'm just curious, for you as a male in nursing, what has that been like, and what challenges have you faced?
In my career, when I worked in a hospital, there was some issues maybe with bias, female bias against the male. You might feel a little left out because you're in the minority. You might be the only male person working on the field, or there's some stereotypes about male nurses versus female nurses with having less compassion or less feeling for the patient. But that kind of went away when I became a hospice nurse, because compassion is the name of the game when it comes to hospice nursing. And in the organization that I work, Samaritan Healthcare and Hospice in New Jersey, they were one of the first 25 or so hospices in the existence of hospices in this country. And my CEO, Marianne Boccolini, has been at the helm since the very beginning. And when I first started in 2010, from the top of the administrative chain all the way down, it was female, top to bottom. Well, the managers, everybody. And it was a wonderful experience. But they do have, I guess, need for a male nurse to do what we talked about earlier about going to those more dangerous areas or going out at night. Getting back to the hospital setting, I recognized kind of quickly that the male-dominated doctor field, back 20 years ago or whenever when I started, there were many more male doctors than there were female. And male doctors treated the male nurses, the few of us that there were, I think, better than they did the female. Like, there was a bias there, I think. So the answer to the whole question would be, I never found it being a challenge, being a male.
So that's really interesting. I was just curious about that perspective, because I can imagine we all have a certain amount of territoriality, I guess, around what we do and who else can do what we do, or who else is as good as I am. So I can imagine that there have been biases, but I'm happy to hear that hospice was a welcoming place, which it should be, because it makes sense that with the diversity of patients that we serve, we need diversity in our hospice staff as well.
That's exactly right. I grew up with a family. There was five siblings. I have one brother and three sisters, and all three of the sisters are in nursing. So I already was outnumbered to begin with. But again, it doesn't occur to me that there's a difference. And I know there is, and I know that some people do have bias, but I can honestly say I've never encountered that. Maybe it's my forward, pleasant disposition most of the time. I don't know, but I never saw it as a challenge.
Yeah, you are pleasant, and as you said, you're a people person, and it seems to
Hmm.
me you have the gift of curiosity as well, which works really well in hospice because you ask questions and you talk to people and you listen really well to their stories, and that's always a good quality to have.
Thank you.
So one of the stories that you tell in the book is the story of your own mother's death, which was before you were working in hospice. I assume, yeah, when she died, that's how you got inspired to join
Hmm.
hospice. But I'm really so glad that you included that story because it completes the picture for us in many ways of what you had experienced. But something that was so poignant that touched me, you described, I think it was the moment the funeral home came to pick up your mother's body, and that the moment the door closed behind them as they left with your mother is when you burst into tears. And that really touched me because I remembered when a similar situation, my own mom, I was taking care of her at her home, and the same thing, the sudden emptiness of the house, the moment the funeral home wheeled her body away was just devastating to me. And so I wanted to share with you that really touched me in the book, but also just for you to reflect a little bit on that experience and your mother's death and how maybe that has informed the work that you do now with hospice patients.
Great. The middle chapter of the book is about mom. It was really the most difficult to write. It was actually the last one that I finished. All those things that happened during that experience. One, it made me want to be a hospice nurse. Two, it guides me in my care for other patients because what you just talked about, when they finally took mom away, there was nobody there, and I was alone, completely alone. It sounds almost uh, adolescent, but I was like, oh, I can't believe this just happened, and it was very emotional for me. And someone did come back in and save me from that terrible emotional breakdown. It's one of the reasons that we and the organization and myself personally, we make sure that someone is with the closest family member when the funeral home is going to be taking that patient away. Most of the time, the funeral home gets there when I'm still there doing paperwork, waiting. But sometimes I have to make that decision and talk to the family. If someone else is there, say with the wife of the patient, then I feel okay. But if the wife is alone, I personally do not leave until the funeral home gets there because I know from my own experience that it can be a very tormenting experience. You think that person's going to be alone now because even though they passed away, right, they're still there in physical being, and you don't realize that loss, that sudden separation when they leave.
And I have a friend, Amy Cunningham, who's a funeral director in New York City, who she talks a lot about that moment when the funeral directors come and are taking the body away, that they should be doing more to make it an easier transition for the family. And so she's trying to educate funeral directors that they themselves could also make this time easier and a more gradual transition and be more respectful of what the family is experiencing in the moment. And so I was really happy to see her awareness of that, the specialness of that time, but also the deep pain for the family in that moment.
Yeah, that's great to hear because being out there all the time, I and my colleagues, we kind of know almost every funeral director that's in the areas that we service. And we know most of them are very good at what they do. I'm kind of amazed. They 3 a.m. they show up, two of them and they're dressed in a tuxedo or a suit, in the middle of the night. The families often remark about that as well. But there are some that aren't quite as enduring or sensitive to the emotional needs. So they're kind of red flags amongst us. So we stay. We stay and make sure. We kind of like guide them through, this is how we're going to do it, or the family doesn't want you to. Something as simple as when they come in with a gurney and a cadaver bag, and they'll sometimes just put the body into the bag and zip it up. So I suggest to them, let's leave that. Can we leave that open? At the face, it looks less harsh, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all steps that we take to try to really ease the loved ones through that moment. This is a critical moment shortly after they pass away, right?
Yes, yeah. Well, I did want to talk about like a couple of really beautiful synchronicities in the book, though I'll tell listeners this is kind of a spoiler alert. So we'll talk about this now, but otherwise it's kind of a surprise, I guess, near the end of the book. But so read the book anyway, because you'll get the full impact of it when you read the book, even though we're talking about it now. But some really beautiful synchronicities. And as you said, these things that happen sometimes when you're out in the field just working with people, and then little surprises that pop up that connect to your own life. And so one of them was the jukebox, if you want to tell a little bit about that story.
I can. It's not really. I appreciate that you're saying it's a spoiler alert, but as I kept writing the stories all throughout the book, I kept finding more and more of these occurrences of things that related to me in a very direct way. So the last chapter, or what I thought was going to be the last chapter of the book, was this person that I went to see. And there's much more to the story, but I'll just give you the general overview. When I went in to see the patient, he was a game person. The floor was tiles, like a chess game. He had some Lionel trains and several other things. But lined up behind him in his room where he was sleeping in bed were these large old-fashioned jukeboxes like you see in a diner where you go put a quarter in, like Happy Days, put a quarter in and you pick the song. And it just reminded me so much of when I was 10 years old. We were living in an older home, and we were getting ready to move, and we moved to a new home. And it was my 10th birthday. My father allowed me to bring all my friends over. And one of the gifts he gave me in the new home was a old-fashioned jukebox. And the jukebox has since gone away, but I still have all these little 45 records there. So I remember talking on the phone with one of my friends in Florida saying, isn't that so ironic? I said, we were moving from the first house, moved into the second house, and I got the jukebox. It just brought me back all these memories of my childhood up until that point. So I didn't think anything of it at the time, but my friend and I both agreed what a perfect way to end the book, the last chapter, bringing it home, right? Mm-hmm. So as I'm on the phone with him, talking about that last chapter in the jukeboxes, the phone rings from my dispatcher, and she says I have to go do a pronouncement. I said, okay, what's the address? And the address that I had to go to was the home that we had moved from prior to the new home where I got the jukebox. So I actually had to go into my childhood home that I hadn't been in for almost 50 years to pronounce a patient. And I thought, you just can't make this up.
Wow.
So I had to make that the last chapter of the book. It was, there's more details. I'm just giving you the general overview, but that's one of the couple of the different nuances or things that happened along the way while writing the book that just, it all comes back to me. It's like full circle. I just know I'm doing the work I'm supposed to do on this earth.
Yeah, exactly. That was just amazing to me to read that, the actual final chapter now of
Yes.
returning to your childhood home and seeing the people, the family that bought the home after your family moved out. It was still the same family. They had lived there all these years.
Yes.
And that connection for you, but also for them. I mean, that had to be amazing for them to find out that you used to live in that very home yourself. And I can't imagine. I get goosebumps to think about that. And as you said, the validation that you're doing the right work, you're where you're supposed to be, being in the right place at the right time, and also that life is amazing, and someone could have written that very story as the script of a movie, and it would have been rejected because it's just too far out. Like, it's just not believable that could actually happen. But sure enough, it did happen.
Hmm.
It's really interesting how when you're doing the work that you're really meant to do, there are ways in which you see why it's the perfect thing. You kind of see how the picture fits together, and that's the message I think that I get from your book too, is how the pictures, the lives of the people you've cared for, the families that you've helped, the threads, I guess, that connect you to all of them, and then that connect us as readers to all of them as well.
So true.
I'm wondering, for you as the author of this book, what are you hoping that readers will get from the book?
Everything that we've talked about, which is how we are all, I think, connected in some way. And as I said earlier, when it brings closure, it brings a little bit of peace to people who have gone through the loss of a loved one. So I think anyone who lost someone, or anyone who is thinking about going on hospice, or anyone who is dealing with grief, I think this is a great book to read. I think all those subtle nuances and all those stories that I talk about each of the personal lives at the end of each chapter is, I think, entertaining in a way, and people can relate. Everyone that reads the book tells me that they can relate, and I've even had them actually start telling me their own story as if I was their nurse.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's very cathartic. I use that word to describe things in the book. There's a catharsis that comes out of and between me and those people that I'm serving. It's a wonderful experience.
Well, Pepper, I want to thank you, first of all, for writing the book. I'm so happy that you got inspired. I mean, you're inspired not only to keep doing the hospice work you do, but also to write about it and to share these stories with all of us. And I'm really grateful for that. So why don't you tell our listeners where they can get your book and how they can connect with you if anyone would like to learn more about what you're doing?
Thank you. I have a website, peppercappuccio.com, that you mentioned earlier. And on the website, there's a direct link to Amazon, where the book is exclusively published through. Or you can go to amazon.com and look up Warm Water, The Last Act of Compassion. In addition to that, when you get to the website, I really recommend you go to the website. I have testimonials on there from people who have read the book with their own view as to how they enjoyed the book. And there's also a bunch of blogs. I've been writing a blog every week, trying to help people, trying to, give back to the readers something that they could look at each week, maybe if they want. Some of the topics are tending to grief. One is about diversity in death. So it's really interesting to do that. And then there's a part on the website where you could sign up, or I can send newsletters, or keep in touch, or announcements, or if I'm doing a book signing, or an event, a lecture, or announcing my second book, which I've already started writing.
Oh, good. So there will be a second one.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Because I'm sure you just keep gathering more stories. So there's more to tell.
Yes, it's unfortunate, but it's every day. Really, it's part of what I do. There's literally hundreds of people have uh, blessed me with giving me the honor of of taking care of them over the past 12 years now, over more than 12 years. So I could probably write a story every day. I think everyone is worth telling a story about.
Yes, yes, for sure. And I know, Carl, that your work is so valued because so many times in the stories I read that families call you an angel and tell you that you've been an angel to them in their lives. And so my hope is that your book will serve that same function for whoever reads the book, who doesn't get to meet you in person, but can read the book and share in some of that beauty and care and compassion that you're bringing into the world.
Thank you. I'm always embarrassed when they say, you're an angel. And I just want to say the angel is the caregiver, but really the angel is the patient, because they are the ones that are, dealing with their own demise, right? And they're the ones that all hopes are they go to heaven, and they are angels. They become an angel. So what I do is something I think is necessary. It's important, of course. And as my CEO of my company always said, we have to understand the impact, the positive impact that we have on patients and their families. It never ceases to amaze me. You might see somebody in a store, grocery store, or department store, and they'll come up to me, several years later, and I may not remember them, but they may have been a cousin or somebody. They'll bring up the whole story and say how wonderful experience it was to have our organization care for their loved one at that time of need.
That's really wonderful. And it is so gratifying. And I'm sure you, like I feel, would encourage anyone who is considering working in hospice to check it out, because it is work that can change your life. And it's so valuable and so worthwhile to give your time to. So anyone who's considering working with hospice, this would be a great book to read if you want to be convinced that that's the right place for you to be.
Great. Thank you.
So thanks again, Carl, and good luck with your next book. And I look forward to reading that in the future.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Pepper Cappuccio. I found it really fascinating to learn about the work of a nurse who primarily does on-call after-hours work, which I hadn't really thought about how unique that setting would be for your entire hospice nursing career to take place in those more twilight hours of being with families and patients, the dark hours when the veil is thin, and just being present during those times, but also having the luxury of more time to spend, though it's in the middle of the night. So you might be exhausted while you're doing it, but really I can appreciate why Pepper enjoys this work and working at particularly this particular shift in hospice. So that was something interesting for me to contemplate. I enjoyed his book and the stories that he shared as well, and his passion for the work that he's doing. So I was happy to support him and recommend his book. So I hope you enjoyed hearing from him as well. If you like this type of content, please recommend it to other people that you think might also benefit from listening. We're trying to grow the audience here of people who care about end-of-life issues. So let them know if you think someone else might benefit from this. You can also help the podcast by subscribing or following on whatever platform you happen to listen to podcasts, and then also leaving a rating and review. So thanks for all of your support. Thanks for being here, listening in with me every week. And if you're new to the podcast, I'll let you know you can go to the webpage for this podcast where you'll find all the archives of previous episodes. You can go to EOLUpodcast.com, and there you'll find all 327 some interviews there, and the show notes and links and all the information you need on that particular webpage. So EOLUpodcast.com. I'll be back next week with another interview for you. So until then, remember, we're here for love. That matters more than anything else. So face your fear. Be ready for whatever happens next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.